All right, good morning. Welcome again to Ridge Church. Welcome to Palm Sunday. Of course, in the midst of such a godly, God-fearing, feel like you're getting ready to be set up group of people living in, residing in, being in the state of North Carolina. Of course, you all picked North Carolina to go all the way in your brackets, right? That one did. The rest of you, church divided. So I'm a Georgia fan, so we're cheering for the NIT. That's fun. The not important tournament if you're into that. But I do have UNC going all the way. All right, so there you go. Anybody else? Just for a record, North Carolina, you're in North Carolina, just want to remind you, and you love God. How many of you have North Carolina going all the way? Let me hear you. Let me see your hands. Like two of you? Okay, all right. See, we're going, we're in it together. All right. So we're wrapping up a series today that we've been in, looking at the journey towards the cross and really the empty tomb, which we're going to celebrate next week. We really celebrate every week that we gather as Christians. But we've been looking at these encounters, three specific individuals we're calling the bad boys of Easter, and their encounters specifically with Jesus, where they met him with resistance, or he met them with resistance, depending on your perspective. But as they encountered, they had agendas. And their agendas put them at odds with Jesus. Last week we talked about Judas, which even if you didn't grow up in church, you know the name Judas, you associate him with betrayal. His name has really become a verb. And we talked about the idea that Judas really wanted to use Jesus for his own agenda. He wanted to use Jesus to help him accomplish his goals in life, help him to get where he needed to go in life. And when it didn't work out like he wanted, as he was using Jesus as a means to an end, he ended up just walking away. He betrays Jesus, he hands Jesus over, and in the end, the consequences of what happens when he goes rogue are on his shoulders. This is the same thing that happens to us. We talked about this last week, that when we go rogue, and when we step away from God's plan, when we go outside of it, the consequences end up being on us, and that's what we saw in Judas' story. But this is what we said to wrap up last week. It doesn't have to go that way. The alternative is this. When we surrender versus doing our own thing, when we surrender specifically to God, God takes responsibility for the outcome. And so that's where we landed. And so you guys know this, or let me ask you if you know this, but you do know, right, that sometimes things are not as they appear. Like sometimes things as they look on the surface level, there's a whole nother layer. There's a whole nother story. There's a perspective. There's something that, in fact, you engaged with it when you were 6, and you engaged with it again when you were 16, and again when you were 36, and the same thing felt different because now your perspective was different because things are not always as they appear. So we're going to do a little test run today and need a little crowd participation. So I want to put an image on the screen, and I want to ask you a question. How many legs does this elephant have? Just keep counting. Same amount of losses as some of your teams. The answer is 4. The actual answer. Some of you are like, no, I see more feet, legs. It's all about perspective, isn't it? Sometimes things aren't as they appear. Let me give you another one. This is the old classic one. How many of you see a young lady kind of looking to her left? How many of you see an older lady? Young lady? How many of you see that? Old lady? Some of you see both? All right, this next one, this one's harder. All right, this one's newer. Some of you haven't seen this one. Is this individual walking, looking to the back, or is she walking, looking forward? All right, so now if you take the R on the right leg, and you assume the other leg is the right leg, isn't she walking backwards? Keep looking. We'll put these on social media later because some of you are like, I don't know, he had some verses, but there was that one image. I had no idea what was happening with that. The funny thing about this one is once I saw it in one direction, then I couldn't see it in the other. Like I tried, but if you reverse the leg, you see it differently. All right, we've got another image for you. Let's see if this one, how many of you see the sweet couple standing down, peering at the water and the beautiful scenery? How many of you see the baby in the womb? How many of you are like, I got nothing. I don't know. I should have had more coffee this morning before I came to church. Perspective is everything, and things are not always as they appear. All right, we got another one I want to show you. Is this individual looking forward, or is this person looking to the left? How many of you say this person's looking forward? How many of you say this person's looking to the left? or right, depending on where you're sitting? How many of you say both? The answer is both. Perspective is everything, and things are not always as they appear. Now, I'm going to do a magic trick. I'm just kidding. I'm not. All right, I have one more. Oh, wait, that was from last week. I'm sorry. So let me just tell you, for those of you who weren't here last week, this was probably the most popular takeaway we've had in the history of our church. I mean, we've given away Bible verses on stickers, nothing. People walk past them. But we give you this, and I've seen pictures of them all week long. So congratulations. If you didn't see it or listen to it, you can go back and watch online. But not everything is as it appears. Like, perspective is such a massive deal. Like, and again, sometimes it's season of life, sometimes it's where you are, sometimes it's where the thing is, but depending on how we're looking and where we are in life, everything can change and things are not always as they appear. And that's the scene that we're going to look at today. In this scenario with the character that he finds himself in, we're going to look at this portion of Scripture where he finds himself in this rhythm or this reality where he realizes, and we're going to look at the moment that he realizes that things are not always as they appear. In fact, this is what often happens to us. Sometimes things are not as they appear in life. And I'll say it this way. The relationship between life and God sometimes is not how it appears. Here's what I mean by this. We tend to think that when life is good, God is good. And we tend to think when life is bad, therefore God is bad. Now, you may not say it out loud. Maybe you would say it out loud depending on the severity of your situation. But this is the natural way. It's not a bad thing. It's just a natural way to think, right? That when life is good, then God must be good. And we're being blessed, and it's a great situation or a great portion of our life or a great moment in our life. We got the promotion, we got the thing, the date happened, whatever it was, right? But then things go bad and we're like, well, I don't know, maybe God is bad. And it's a natural way to think because after all, if he is God, then he could have run the play very differently and the outcome in my life could have been different. We're going to look at the moment where an individual discovers, again, that things are not always as they appear. And it's a moment where he had come to a conclusion that my life and my situation is bad, therefore God must be bad. But then his challenge, his perspective gets challenged just a little bit. Now, this character, this last bad boy of Easter, interestingly, we don't even know his name. Here's what we know. Something has gone off the rails in his life, and he finds himself in a Roman prison. His life is spun out of control, and now his life is going to serve as an example of what it looks like when you defy Rome. What happens when you stand against Rome? What happens when you do something you shouldn't do? And now here he is, condemned to death by crucifixion. Now, no doubt this guy had seen crucifixions. It was a very normal part of the punishment of the Roman culture. They didn't invent it, but they perfected it. And so here he is at the point of his death. And this guy has decided, you know what? I'm going to be defiant all the way to the end. And the chances are good that he doesn't have a lot of friends left. Most people didn't want to be associated with someone on the cross. You didn't want to get close to it. You didn't want to happen to you. You didn't want to be anywhere near the cross or the criminals who found themselves on the cross. And so here he is thinking he's headed to his final day all alone. And then I can only imagine on that morning where he's set to be crucified. And I don't know how the scene is. The scriptures don't give us the details, but I can only imagine there's a stir. And he starts to hear the commotion. And then he realizes, oh, I'm not going to die alone today. He finds out that he's going to be crucified next to this Jewish rabbi named Jesus that has become famous and infamous all in the same sentence. Everywhere he went, there were crowds, including to the crucifixion. So there he's going to have all these onlookers to his crucifixion. We learned last week again that Jesus was betrayed at the end by one of his closest friends. And now here he is in this moment, an innocent man about to be crucified. Now Luke, who captured all this, eyewitness, but also was an investigator, Luke said this about himself. He said, I investigated all these things, talking about what he wrote down in the book of Luke. He says, I investigated all these things thoroughly. And here's what he means. He's like, guys, I can only imagine as he's writing this, he's thinking, this is going to be hard to believe. They're never going to believe this. He says, trust me. Look, I'm a historian. He was a doctor. He was a detail person. He said, I'm writing down things that the future audience is going to have a really tough time to believing. And I want to tell them, listen, guys, trust me. I thoroughly investigated all of these things. And he records this scene where this criminal discovers that things aren't always as they seem. And this is how it goes in Luke chapter 23. It says, 2 other men, both criminals, were led out led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. And listen, we fly by these verses like if you grew up in church, you've heard this over and over again, but those 4 words, they crucified him, just rolls off the tongue, and we're done. But crucifixion was a horrible, horrible thing. Oftentimes, again, the Romans didn't create crucifixion, but they had perfected it. They'd gotten it to a point where they wanted to create as much punishment and pain as they could for as long as they could. So there were times where crucifixion would last for days. A criminal would be on the cross for days, and they would stretch out the suffering. A lot of times when you see the depictions in Hollywood of the cross will be way up high and the people will be way down low. But the Roman crosses were actually usually very close to the ground because they wanted people that were looking on to experience it at eye level. They wanted it to be, it was like a humiliating experience and a fear-based experience. They wanted everyone watching the crucifixion to be reminded that you don't mess with Rome. They wanted everyone to be humiliated who was actually on the cross. And so it was a terrifying scene. Yeah, we see it in these 4 words. They crucified him there, but it was a huge deal. Then Jesus says something that no one even thinks when they're on a cross, let alone says. This is what he says. Jesus said, Father, forgive them. He's hanging on the cross. Father, forgive them. Forgive who? The people who are torturing him. His followers who have all abandoned him at this point. Some of them have denied that they ever knew him. He's saying, Father, forgive them. Who? All of them. The religious leaders that we've talked about in this series that were just bent to get Jesus out at all costs because he was a threat to their way of life. He was a threat to their wealth, to their influence, to their power. He says, forgive them. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Jesus is saying this. He's saying, Father, they don't see. He's looking, he's saying, Father. He is one with the Father, but somehow God the Father is unique, and the Son is unique. He's saying, Father, they don't forgive them. They don't see what we see. They can't see the perspective. He's saying, Father, things are not always as they appear. And they just don't know it yet. They don't understand. It says, and they divided up his clothes by casting lots. See, the enemies are mocking. They're celebrating. They're monetizing Jesus' pain, literally. They're figuring out which parts of his garments they're going to take home, who's going to get what. This is like this crucifixion scene. It's like if you've ever been watching a sporting event and there's some kind of horrible injury, like and you look away, but then they show the replay and you look again and you rewind, you look again and you replay and you look again. It's like terrible and awful and terrible and awful, but you can't look away. This is the scene. This is what crucifixions were. And people are watching, and it's a terrible scene, and they can't look away. And it says this in verse 35. The people stood watching, and the rulers, this is the religious leaders, that had been, again, their sole agenda was to get Jesus out of power because he was a threat to their way of life. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. Finally, they won. I mean, Jesus had been humiliating these guys in the public square, taking them to school every single time they tried to debate him, humiliate them every single time. And here they are. He's hanging on the cross. They have finally won. Their biggest threat is on the losing end, right there in the public square. They said, he saved others. Let him save himself. If he is God's Messiah, they're mocking him. If he is the chosen one, here's the moment. These religious leaders are like, hey guys, see, we told you. We told you he's not who he said. Because this is the proof. If he was God, then he would save himself. It's plain and simple. If he was God, he would take himself off the cross. And listen, you and I have been there, haven't we? Haven't we been in situations where we're like, man, if God is God, then why is this happening? If God is who he said, if God has the power, or maybe you didn't stop questioning God's power, but you started questioning his character. Like, man, if God is good, then why? And you fill in the blank. Then why didn't? Then why did? And this is the moment. They're saying, listen, it's obvious because God isn't doing what we thought God would do in this situation. Then he must not be God or he must not be good. But here's the thing. Things are not always as they appear. Sometimes the vantage point is everything. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar. And they said, if you're the king of the Jews, then save yourself. They're all taking on the same mantra. There was a written notice above him which read, this is the king of the Jews. Not because they believed he actually was, because they're saying, hey, your reckless, your silly claim to be king is going to become your fate. And then Luke focuses on one of the criminals, again, unnamed. Matthew actually talks about both of the criminals and said that both of the criminals that were on the sides of Jesus hurled insults at him. But this is what Luke says. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself. The religious leaders are saying it. Every single one of the soldiers are saying this. And now here the criminal on the cross is saying it too. Hey, the logical conclusion from everybody watching's vantage point is, hey, if you had the power to do something about this, then you would. If you were God, this wouldn't be happening to you for sure, and it probably wouldn't be happening to us. This guy didn't care about Jesus, but he's thinking, hey, if I was really next to God, then I think you'd sort this thing out, which makes logical sense. That's the conclusion that everybody watching was coming to. If you are God, then something would be going different than how this is going. But things aren't always as they appear. Something interesting happens. You got the two guys that are on either side of Jesus that are being crucified. These criminals. And again, Matthew tells us that both of them are hurling insults. And then at one point, one of them stops. He has a moment of realization. He has an aha moment. In fact, I've seen this for years. It happened in my own life. I've seen it happen in some of your lives. Some of you've seen it happen in your life or the life of someone you know or love. For some of you, this is coming soon in your life. An aha moment where there's literally a 180 and everything flips around. It says this, but the other criminal rebuked him. One criminal talking to the other criminal says, don't you fear God? Don't you fear God? Like, I wonder if this Molly's like, dude, like 10 seconds ago, you were making fun of him as well. Like, what happened? He says, since you were under the same sentence, we are punished justly. In other words, he's saying, look, I know what I did. You know what you did. A lot of people know what we did. Your mom knows what you did. That's why she's not talking to you. That's why she's not here. Everybody knows what we did. But this guy, he says, we're getting what our deeds deserve. But this man's done nothing wrong. Everybody knew it. Everybody knew. This is why it was such a spectacle. This man who had healed, this man had done nothing but been kind, been good, taught amazing things. Now here he is, this good man, and he's being crucified. Perhaps they'd heard the rumor that even Pilate, the Roman governor, said, hey, I'm washing my hands of this. I can find no wrong in this man. Yet here they are in this moment. Calls God the Father to forgive his punishers. This is what Jesus is doing. He says, Jesus, forgive the ones who are perpetrating the harm. Forgive the ones who don't believe. Forgive the ones who are hurling insults. And I wonder if this criminal is thinking, just a moment hits him. He's like, who does that? Here, this crucifixion scene that is meant to be a power play for the religious leaders of the day. And unbeknownst to them, because things are not always as they appear, this is the greatest power play of God the Father that has ever happened in human history. And in this moment, Jesus, who is innocent, is suffering the same as someone who's guilty. This criminal, back to him, I wonder if he's thinking in this moment. We don't get all of his thoughts, but I wonder if he's seeing it and thinking, if an innocent man who's suffering like a guilty man, in that moment of pain, forgives those who are perpetrating the harm. If he forgives the abusers, what does that mean? And the scriptures tell us that the lights come on, and there's some kind of realization like, oh, and I wonder if it was like, oh no, this guy really is the Messiah. I wonder if there was a moment for the criminal where he looked over at the sign that was meant to mock Jesus. It says, here he is, the King of the Jews, and he realized, oh, he actually is the King of the Jews. In that moment of realization, then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Remember me. Like here he is on the cross. Jesus, hey, remember me. He couldn't say, hey, I'm going to be good from now on. There's no now on there's nothing after the cross. He had no bargaining chips. He had nothing to offer Jesus. There was nothing for him to give. This is how we work sometimes. We don't even realize it, but it's the nature of religion. We barter with God. God, if you, then I will. God, if you, then I will. He has nothing to bargain with. There is no reason that Jesus should bend in his direction. He has nothing to give to Jesus. But here's the good news for us. It's never about what we have to bargain with. It's never about what we have to offer. It's not about us at all. In this moment, he says, hey, can I come into your kingdom? And Jesus replies, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Because it wasn't about what he had to offer. It was about what Jesus had to offer. One of the lessons from this scene, this entire crucifixion scene and this conversation or interaction with the criminals and the religious leaders that are mocking Jesus and the soldiers that are saying, if you're God, then come off the cross, is that God cannot be reduced to our personal experience. And God cannot be reduced to our vantage point. Sometimes things aren't going the way that we thought they would with a good God, and he's still a good God. We just can't see it from the right perspective. Even on our worst days, God is still good. Even in the midst of the deepest and most heartfelt prayer that we prayed that is yet to be answered, God is still good. It says it was about noon. Darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. Such a little detail. We don't even pay attention to it. Amos, the prophet, prophesied that this would happen over 700 years before it happened, for those of you that tend to have a little inner skeptic. Isaiah prophesied that this would happen over 700 years before it happened. Historians, non-Christian historians, have validified this, many of them. You can find tons of them. Rufinus, a Greek historian, said this, search your writings, and you shall find that in Pilate's time, and when he says search your writings, he's saying, hey, a lot of people have written about this. A lot of my counterparts, a lot of people recorded this in history. Search your writings, and you shall find that in Pilate's time, when Christ suffered, the sun was suddenly withdrawn, and darkness followed. This happened in human history and was recorded by people that didn't even believe in Jesus, that weren't Jewish. It says, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, Luke continues. Now, I don't know what kind of Bible understanding you've grown up with, what you understand about this moment, but this was significant. This curtain that was torn in two was separating the common areas of the Jewish religious circle from the most important areas, what we know as the Holy of Holies, where it was said to be the place where the very presence of God existed. This was the introduction. Jesus had been saying, hey, I'm bringing a new thing. I'm doing a new thing. In my kingdom, things are going to work different. There had been this temple model up until this day. And Jesus says, no, I'm introducing a brand new thing. And this was the signifier. Jesus says, no, in my kingdom, there are no rules and regulations about you getting to God, but through me, everyone has access to the Holy of Holies. Everyone has access to a relationship with God. Everyone has access to the person of God. It's relational. And then this beautiful thing, it was torn from the top down, not the bottom up. God did through Jesus from the top down what our efforts from the bottom up can never do. And he signifies it in this moment. He destroyed the separation between God and man. It's this beautiful thing. This is why we celebrate Easter, the most incredible event in human history. Jesus, it continues, Luke continues, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he had said this, he breathed his last. Is it possible that all of us, maybe in ways that we're aware of, maybe in some ways that we're not aware of, is it possible that we've drawn conclusions about God based on what happened to us, based on what didn't happen, based on what we thought or how we thought, if God is God? Because remember, they're in this moment. There he is. Ironically, they're looking for God. They're saying, where is he? And he's 3 feet away from them, hanging on a cross, but he wasn't acting how they thought God would act in that moment. Is it possible that when God didn't act in a moment the way we thought he would act, we chose to believe that he was either not a good God or not a God at all? Is there something about our situation where we thought, God, if God was God, and this is what they're thinking, guys, if God is God, then he wouldn't be on a cross. If you ever thought if God was God, then this thing that happened, I shouldn't still have it happening. This thing should have never been allowed. It makes logical sense. And the criminal on the cross next to Jesus started there, thinking, if you were really God, then you wouldn't be here. Probably neither would we. But this is where it ends. He has this realization, this is a terrible situation. You are God. And in this moment, you are here dispensing forgiveness to the very people that are accusing you and murdering you. I just want to encourage you this morning. God is always near. And things are not always as they appear. Even when the outcomes aren't what you hoped, even when the outcomes aren't what I hope, listen, God can heal. And sometimes he does and sometimes he doesn't. Even when the outcomes aren't what you hoped for, when you didn't get the job, didn't get into the school, you got a diagnosis you didn't expect, whatever, God is still God, even when the outcomes aren't what we expect. Because listen, sometimes things are not as they seem. God can be trusted in spite of our experiences, in spite of how the election goes, in spite of pandemics, in spite of the diagnosis, in spite of the relationship and how hard it is when you thought it was going to be so much easier at this point, in spite of whatever's happening in your life, God can be trusted. Nothing about this crucifixion scene seemed fair. Nothing about it seemed fair. Yet the outcome, guys, the outcome is the reason we're in the room. Nothing about it seemed fair, but the outcome changes everything for humanity. But let me change that for you and me. Because Jesus remained on the cross, he had all authority and all power to come off of that cross. But because he chose to stay on that cross, it is the greatest news in human history. And here's the thing. If we just open our hands and we surrender this life-giving peace, grace that we see in the scriptures in the narrative of Jesus, this Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing, that ethos becomes the defining reality of our lives, to live at peace when there's chaos around us. So here's the question. Would you be willing to surrender? Would I be willing to surrender in spite of what life has handed you and how life has treated you? This is an offer. It's a beautiful offer. It's the gospel. It's an offer of peace and purpose. As we wrap up, I just want to say this. God can intervene. He can. Whatever you're going through, like whatever you bring into this room, you may be in the high point of your life, you may be in the low point of your life or somewhere in between, but God can intervene. But what happens when he does it? God can resolve all of your doubts. Like some of you come in with like legitimate like questions. God can resolve all of your doubts. But what happens when he doesn't? God can literally move the mountains. But what happens when he doesn't? God can literally part the waters. But what happens when he doesn't? Does he cease to be God? Do we then label and decide that he is not a good God? Or is it possible that sometimes things are not as they appear? Perhaps, even when we don't understand, even when we don't have the whole picture, when we don't have the proper perspective. Here these guys are thinking, if he's God, he'll come off the cross. And Jesus is thinking, because I'm God, I cannot come off the cross. They had no idea that you and I hung in the balance. They had no idea. The bigger thing, Jesus is like, what is happening here is so much bigger than this single moment. What if our perspective sometimes is off? God can be trusted. The question is simple. Will you? Can you? Will I? He can be trusted, regardless of the outcomes. And sometimes he changes the outcomes. God can be trusted. Will you? And let me just say, it is a step of faith. Putting your faith in a God that you cannot see, but he's proved himself in history. He's proved himself in the lives of so many of us. God can be trusted. And so to close this series, I wanted just to create some space. Again, we're leading towards a celebration of the most significant event that happened in human history. We're going to celebrate that next week. But I wanted to create space for us just to receive this, to sit in this reality, sit in the moment, and perhaps even just internally for you to surrender and say, all right, God, whether it goes the way I want it to or not. Here's the thing, and maybe it's not all of your life. Again, maybe we've talked about surrender every single week in this series. Maybe it's some portion of your life, a relationship, something you've been holding on to, a fear, an insecurity, some kind of thing in your past that you're holding on to and it's holding you back and you just surrender it. Or maybe you just declare quietly. Maybe you declare it out loud as you can. I'll leave that up to you. You just say, God, I trust you. I don't understand all. And I know that sometimes things are not as they appear, but I'm choosing to trust that you are a good God. You have the power regardless of the outcome, and I trust you. That's what real faith looks like. Real faith isn't just believing that God will orchestrate things as you see fit. It's believing that he's good even when we don't see it. So tell God. In the midst of this song, just tell God, I want to trust you. Maybe take the step. Maybe your wrestling can be just part of your prayer, your declaration as they sing that, God, I want to trust you, but I'm being honest, I'm having a tough time. But even say that. Let that be your first step. God, I trust you. God, I want to trust you regardless of the outcome. We learn a powerful lesson from this last bad boy, the one on the cross next to Jesus. That sometimes things are not as they appear. God is good, and he can be trusted. I want to pray for us, and we're going to sing together. Father, you're good. You're gracious. And there's a lot of bad stuff still in life. There's a lot of things that we can't fully understand. I pray that in these moments, you would allow us just to recognize your goodness, that you're sovereign, that you're powerful, that because you are God, you did not come off the cross. And perhaps there's something in our life that we just don't have the proper perspective, and that you're working something together that's bigger than we could ever imagine. God, allow us just to bleed trust in this room in you. God, give us the faith to punch through the moments and the things we don't understand. Pray all this in Jesus' precious and powerful name. Amen. I want you to sit. The band's going to sing this song over you. Just reflect. Let it be your declaration. Let it be a celebration, whatever you need it to be. And just saying, God, I trust. I choose to trust you.